Michelle has spent over 3 decades helping the world's top decision makers navigate some of the most complex challenges of our time. You're a former US Army intelligence officer, and you served as presidential daily briefer to President Barack Obama.
I did.
You now work with global business leaders and help them make sense of geopolitical turbulence, from cyber threats to AI to climate. So the daily intelligence briefer basically every single day is the first person to brief Barack Obama on what's going on in the world. How has that shaped how you interpret today's geopolitical landscape?
That's a great question because I didn't realize it, but 2012 was kind of a pivotal year in geopolitics. I might be biased because that was the year that I spent with the president, but prior to that, my focus, my lens had been really just on supporting warfighters and, commanders on the ground. With the kind of intelligence they needed to make battlefield decisions. This really upped my game, and I had to really learn. I was exposed to so many things that I had never seen before. At that time, we were facing Grexit, right? So I had to learn about economics and how economics sort of plays into national security. I had to learn Iran and Israel were going at it, tit for tat. So I had to learn about nuclear stuff, which I had never had to worry about before as a tactical or operational intelligence officer. And so in general, 2012 was an incredible year because I think it set the foundation for the geopolitical crises and problems that are unfolding today. And let me give you a little example or explain why I think that. Okay. So in 2012, if you recall, President Obama said that the US was going to pivot to Asia. We had spent too much time focusing on the Middle East and on oil, and that China was actually becoming a rising power and was at some point going to be a peer competitor. A lot of people didn't agree with that, but in the end, it turns out that he was right. Mm-hmm. And 2012 was the year that Xi Jinping actually came to power. He, and he set the strategy and the vision for the next 30 to 40 years. Just in that first year alone, he purged the entire leadership. He started for the first time. Started to develop Chinese soft power with the Belt and Road Initiative. It was the first time we heard of BRI. We called it OBOR at the time, mm-hmm. One Belt, One Road. And most importantly, but quietly, that was the year that they started to really increase the amount of money that they were putting into military power, by the percentage of GDP. So I think President Obama saw the writing on the wall. Also in Russia, that was the year that Putin came to power, and he started talking about this, Russian revanchism, where Russia got a raw deal, and it really wanted to, to go back to the Soviet Union style leadership and control. And I think Putin at the time also was learning to develop his own means of soft power. And that came on the heels of the failed Arab Spring, which happened the year before in 2011. Remember, 2012 was the year that Syria fell into civil war, and that opened the door for Russia to come in and become, a soft power broker in the Middle East. So if you look at it that way, you can see that all of the seeds for where we are today started really, or had their root in 2012, including this last piece. I call this the 4 R's, and this last piece of this resurgence of resentment politics, where a lot of these populations in a lot of countries who did not fare as well in globalization, which was supposed to be this, rising tide that lifted all boats. Yes, it did lift them all. It just didn't lift them all equally. And that inequity created a lot of resentment, which turned into resentment or grievance politics, which it led to, Grexit, which led to Brexit, which led to Trump, which is where we are now. And we see this, these resentment politics, it's populism rearing their ugly heads on the far right in Europe and even here in the United States.
You've got a 360-degree approach to your advisory and how you interpret today's geopolitical landscape. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I like to tell I love to use metaphors. It's because I think it's the easiest way to relate complex information. So I tell my clients that looking at geopolitics is like looking through a kaleidoscope. Inside a kaleidoscope, when you look at it, you see that there's all these tiny little pieces, of glass or plastic, and there are different colors and different sizes and different shapes. And when you look in there, it makes a shape, right? A geometric pattern. When you start shifting, the kaleidoscope, nothing is added, right? You're not adding more data points or more information, right? You're not adding more pieces of glass or plastic. You're not taking any out. You're just shifting the frame, the lens a little bit. So you get a different perspective on the information that's in front of you today. And so that's my 360-degree sort of lens is when I look at something. First, I try to understand, is this a structural or a cyclical occurrence that we're analyzing or exploring? And then I try to look at all these different pieces, right? And I use this pestle framework as those little pieces inside, right? So you're looking at these different factors that have an impact, and that's political, economic, social, technologies, legal, regulatory, compliance, environmental, and security issues, right? So those are all those tiny little data points that are in there. And then I do this sort of what I call geopolitical geometry. So all of those data points, you remember from geometry, you have, two data points in a line, right? Or two data points together becomes a line, three data points, four. And then you can kind of see where the trajectory of the line is going as you're collecting those data points. And then where it's really interesting is when two lines intersect, right? So you're watching this line and then you're watching this line and then they intersect. And that is an inflection point that businesses can use to make decisions about, opportunities or risks, right? And then over time, these dots form patterns that you can identify and understand. And oftentimes those patterns become shapes that we can recognize. So we can say, oh, this is a security threat, or this is going to be, like it's only partially formed. So this is going to be an economic threat when it's fully formed, right? So by doing that, you can anticipate these sort of threats and risks, and you can avoid surprise, which is nobody likes surprise, right? Like policymakers, governments, businesses, nobody likes surprise.
I do like surprises, but I do guess on that sense, yeah. So let's say we're looking at a kaleidoscope right now of the world before shifting it. We have leaders like we've got Trump, we've got Putin, we've got issues in the Middle East, we've got Ukraine, we've got climate change. When we shift the kaleidoscope, what are things that we aren't really seeing?
So I think what's happening right now is this slow erosion and fragmentation of power centers. We're moving away from that bipolar. So it was unipolar. The US made most of the rules after World War II, right? And up through the end of the Cold War. And then, like I said, in 2012, China emerges and rises, and it starts to become a bipolar world. And now that bipolar world is fracturing even further into a multipolar world. And it's easy to just get focused or hung up on just those two big powers, the US and China. But that really would be a mistake, because when you do shift that kaleidoscope, you start to see that new power brokers are emerging, right? So the middle powers like Korea and Vietnam and Turkey especially, these are new like middle power brokers that are actually going to be centers of influence pretty soon, right? And so especially like in the Turkey central corridor, the middle corridor, that's going to replace some of these other well-trafficked corridors that of commerce that we've been so accustomed to using. And then I also think that there are other power brokers that are emerging that we're not paying attention to, like multinational corporations, right? So for example, let's just take Starlink, let's take even, Elon Musk, right? He is a non-state actor, and he is a huge power broker, right? He came into the US government and basically remade the entire federal government, right? He rearranged, he, fired a lot of people, and he made policy without even being elected, right? So he is basically a non-state actor who's having an incredible amount of influence on the world, right? And not just there, but he also, because he owns Starlink, after the Trump-Zelensky meeting that didn't go so well, he responded to Trump's ire over Trump's perceived lack of gratitude by the Ukrainians. And so in order to sort of teach them a lesson, he told Elon Musk, maybe you should just turn off the Starlink satellite coverage, which, by the way, it's not Ukraine or the US that pays for that, it's Poland. So a non-state actor, which is a corporate, right? He was able to influence the outcome of a war, right? Like, I mean, so these are the things that I'm watching sort of unfold that are a little bit concerning for me, that are trends that are pretty dangerous because there's no accountability and there's no sort of control over how these actors operate. And it's not just Starlink or Musk. I mean, when you think about it, Amazon has more, their annual revenues are more than the bottom 80 countries' GDP. Right? That's pretty frightening. And the amount
Money
of
is power.
influence, right? Money is power. He controls logistics nodes. He bought the Washington Post. So, he controls a media outlet. And Amazon, most people don't realize this, but AWS, Amazon Warehouse Services, controls the US government cloud. So all the cloud services, the black cloud, which is classified intel, as well as white cloud. So these are, I think, things that these are geopolitical actors that people aren't even aware of that are shaping policy today behind the scenes.
What's worst case scenario in a way? Like if looking forward 5-10 years when these companies and all these sort of big tech have more and more power.
It does worry me. I do think there will be some, guardrails, but we haven't put them on yet, right? And that's because, another threat that we're facing right now is this fragmented regulatory environment, which is really hard for and will be increasingly more difficult for companies and corporates to navigate. So technology, for example, right? Like governance for AI is different in the EU than it is for the US than it is for China. So if you are trying to build a product, right, and now everything talks to the Internet of Things, right? So you have to decide which governance model you're going to build for, because it is cost prohibitive for you to build 3 different products that meet 3 different standards, right? So I think that when it comes to regulatory environments, those are going to be weaponized. And I think that's where these really big players, technology companies and non-state actors that are like multinational corporates, that's where they're going to have an outsized impact. Is, like they're not going to want a playing field that is uneven and where they have to build 3 different technology devices for 3 different standards. So I think I see that being a challenge, right? I think that's going to be something we're going to have to adapt to and overcome. And I think that is, while it is concerning, that's going to be a place where politicians are going to try to rein in these big companies, but they will definitely have a seat at the table in the next, new world order.
Yeah. Because look, we had a conversation about this earlier, looking at global institutions like the UN, the World Trade Organization. They exist and they worked in a world that maybe doesn't exist anymore. They've failed to deliver on what they meant to deliver on. What is your take on what's happening with those sort of global institutions? What's causing this erosion of trust? What might come next?
So I think the erosion of trust is because they were designed by the wealthy countries. And then when the wealthy countries who contributed the most amount of money to keep these, multilateral institutions alive, when the multilaterals started trying to, keep them in check and trying to ensure that they didn't have an outsized impact, I think that the rules that were designed to favor those Western countries, they just didn't work anymore, right? Because the Western countries are like, I'm just not going to do that, right? And what are you going to do? How are you going to make me? There's no enforcement mechanism, and if we take away your funding, then there's really nothing that you can do. So they don't have any enforcement authority. And also, again, like these middle powers that I'm talking about, like, Brazil and India, they don't have fair representation, right? But they have huge populations. So if they decide that they're not going to support UN sanctions, right, which they did not support the UN sanctions against Russia in its invasion in Ukraine, then there's nothing that anyone can do, right? So these institutions are now like, they're sort of like trapped in a gridlock because of their veto and soft veto power politics. And And they've become feckless organizations, and they've lost legitimacy because they failed to deliver, vaccine equity. They don't enforce sanctions fairly and evenly. They don't have the ability to do what they were designed to do. And that's actually, again, I hate to use the word design yet, but by design, because they were starting to rein in these more wealthy countries. So I think that's why they've lost legitimacy and credibility. And in terms of what's going to replace them, we like to call them, like in geopolitics, mini laterals, like BRICS plus, like the Weimar plus, and the Quad and AUKUS. Those are going to replace these big multilateral institutions. And I think what's going to replace the IMF and the World Bank, and it's already happening, are these other economic institutions like the AIIB and the New Development Bank, and even BRI, right? So I think that's what's coming next.
Something else will take its place that's adapted and built for this world in which we live. Yeah, because so much has changed.
Correct.
Just talking about Trump a little bit more, he has really changed the political playbook. What does the post-Trump landscape look like?
In terms of the post-Trump landscape, I think that a lot of norms are being broken right now. And if I had to characterize, what Trump has done for politics in general, not just American politics, but even global politics, is that he has broken through what we like to call the fourth wall of politics, right? Where he has exposed the fact that, like cultural norms and political norms are only as strong as what we're willing to enforce, right? Again, like if no one cares about its falling, then no one's going to buttress it, right? And the institutions that we have are not, they're not holding up to that, right? In some cases they are. Rule of law is still holding up, but some of the others, like congressional norms, in fact, it's supposed to be up to Congress to be able to adjust tariffs and make tariff policy. Trump basically took that away, even though that's a congressional right. And nobody in Congress in power right now has pushed back on that. So I think what he has done has changed the new playbook, has exposed weaknesses, has written a new code book on what like trust and loyalty and truth really look like, and what they look like on paper versus what they look like in real life. And he has changed Washington to be much more transactional than relational. Like under the previous eras of, with different presidents, they have worked really hard to build relationships, right? On both sides of the aisle, across the pond, right? Like that has been their style. It is really relationship based. Trump has changed that to be a very transactional type of policymaking. And I don't think that's going to change. I don't think that, even if Democrats come back to power, that we're going to go back to just relationship based politics. And I think that what he has done is he has made it acceptable to have performative politics, like political theater, right? Like that's now okay and almost
makes great TV.
Right?
He says it all the time.
Exactly. And I think he has really shown politicians the power of media dominance, right? Like controlling the media, controlling the message, controlling the narrative, right? And then lastly, I think he has demonstrated the power also of personalized politics, right? That it's Trump, right? Because right now, nobody can say anything against Trump, even in his own party. No one else is allowed to have an identity except for him. It's a very personalized politics. And what I think that other global leaders are going to take away from this is like what I call the DIMS, right? So they're going to, disruption is going to be the brand, right? I think they're going to use
shaking things up.
Yeah. They're going to use institutions as tools to leverage power and to get their personal politics through. And then I think lastly, they're going to use media in the similar way that Trump did, and they're going to use polarization as a strategy, right? Like that is the strategy. It's not just a byproduct of strong policies. It is the strategy. Is we have to keep these different groups and factions away from one another, because just like with terrorism, right? Like in intelligence, when you allow these different terrorist groups to work together and use the same networks and recruiting and financing or whatever, they become very strong, right? We don't want that. That like this kind of politics that Trump has created, that's not the blueprint. And I think this is going to go forward. I don't think that, this is a huge risk that I tell all my clients. They need to stop thinking that we're going to go back to the way things were, because we are never going to go back to the way things were. And I think that this is going to become a new type of politics. It's not populism. It is literally like it's Trump's own brand.
For global leaders trying to make sense of American policy, and understand the complex dynamics within Washington, because the landscape has changed so quickly. How can businesses make sense of what's going on in Washington and how it's impacting the world, really?
So the first thing to understand is that the Washington consensus is dead. There is no more consensus. It is sort of a cult of personality. It's all personality driven. And I think that what we're seeing now is sort of like this decoupling from like visible authority, right? That is given to you by being elected or appointed or being in government. And then these invisible networks that work behind the scenes to set policy. And the people that have power in Washington right now are people with money or with a microphone, right? So if they have a big social media presence, if they are very loud and vocal and they have a lot of followers, that can provide influence. But the other piece of influence is the money piece, right? Especially in American politics, because the amount after Citizens United passed, the amount of money that has gone into political campaigns is incredible. It is astounding. I mean, Elon Musk donated over $250 million, right, to President Trump's campaign. And then because of Citizens United and other legislation, any money that is not used in the campaigns belongs to that candidate, right? So, I mean, it's just, if you really want to understand, the power in Washington and the networks in Washington, follow the money and look at, the influence of groups like lobbyists and outsized like social media voices. I'll give you another great example. Laura Loomer, right? Okay. Laura Loomer just has a social media, presence. She is not an elected official. She's not anywhere in government. She is she's just started her own lobbying group, but she went in, she had a conversation with President Trump, and literally an hour later, like there was an announcement that his national security team was being dismissed because she said that she had done her due diligence and they were not loyal team players. And that brings me to another really important point about Washington, is that this president values loyalty over experience or expertise. And that's how you get ahead, and that's how you make policies in Washington right now. Doesn't matter if you have a PhD from Harvard in government. It matters if you are loyal to the president and loyal to what the president has said that he wants. There is no one unified voice. There is no one unified foreign policy. It is whatever, it's very transactional, and it's whatever the president wants at the time, which means that it's also very subject to change. It's very capricious and subject to change based on polling, on social media, on pushback, on elections, right? And news headlines. So markets, right? How markets react or respond. That's what influences these days, not your original traditional like power that is given to you through your, the authority that you have based on your role, your position in government.
Yeah. Shifting more towards AI and this massive geopolitical race around AI and quantum computing. How do you think these technologies will shape national power and multinational businesses? Also, an incredibly loaded question, because that was an AI and quantum computing, but I guess let's start with AI and then we can move on to quantum computing.
Well, it's actually great that you're putting them sort of in comparison to one another, because I like to talk about technologies being either disruptive or decisive, right? And AI is clearly a disruptive technology. And What I mean by that is, your Keurig, right? Like that was a disruptive technology, right? It changed the way that we made coffee and made us more efficient, right? We use less coffee every day, and we still got our caffeine hits so we could have clarity and make it through the day, right? But that didn't mean that you totally got rid of all the Mr. Coffees, right? You could still make a whole pot of coffee if you want, and today you can still buy a Mr. Coffee one pot at a time, kind of maker, right? It just sort of improved your efficiency and made things operationally efficient. Quantum is not a disruptive technology, it's a decisive technology. And a decisive technology is like the automobile, right? Once we had automobiles, nobody went back to wagons, nobody, unless it, like your, city park or whatever. But in general, for transportation, people are not using horse and buggy anymore to get around. And you couldn't buy, well, maybe just the Amish, yes. But you would be hard pressed here in London to go out and buy a horse and buggy if that's how you wanted to get to work every day, right? Sure. So a decisive technology gives a decisive advantage to whoever masters it first, right? Not just adopts it and embraces it, but masters it first. So AI helps us to improve operations, right, and helps us to make our improve our problem solving skills. Quantum is going to solve the problems, right? So one is improving problem solving skills, right? At scale, it's helping us to, think smarter and get more done. And the other one is helping us to actually solve problems that we can't solve today. And one actually accelerates knowledge and learning, and the other one creates knowledge and learning. And that's, I think, the difference. And so that is why AI and quantum are both national security imperatives for every country in the world and for every company, because whoever masters quantum especially, but AI and quantum together, whoever masters that first will have decision advantage, and decision advantage is everything, right? On the battlefield, who reads the map better? Who reads the map first, right? On the battlefield, who makes the first shot, right? Who claims the first victory? That sets the entire tone for the whole war. And so we're going to see quantum change everything from, simultaneous cryptography, right, where you're going to be able to simultaneously encrypt and decrypt. I know, right? To like creating new drugs, to literally everything you can think of is going to be changed in a way that we can't even imagine right now, because that's what quantum does. It helps us it creates new things that don't even exist right now, not even in our minds.
Who's leading the quantum race right now? Is it China?
So US and China are neck and neck. Every time I read something, like one day it's like, oh, the Chinese have mastered this, or like one step closer, right? And then they're ahead of us. And then, oh no, the US, like in Silicon Valley, they've mastered this and they've done that. So we are literally neck and neck. And it's like this race where, like here's the finish line. And it's like, okay, for 1 second, China's ahead, and then the US ahead, and then China, and then the US. So we are neck and neck. But I would not be surprised to see other countries quietly creeping up on us, right? Because this literally is a national security imperative for every country.
So if China have more sophisticated quantum computing, they would be able to hack everything, every single business in the world, every single bank, the US, the most highbrow intelligence ever. So how would something like World War III pan out in a situation like that?
I mean,
how plausible is World War III right now?
Very plausible. I think we are the closest that we've been in my lifetime, and definitely in your lifetime, to World War III. I mean, tensions are high. Like when you look at even geopolitical disputes like the recent Pakistan-India dispute really bring us inching us closer and closer and closer to some sort of nuclear event, right? Whether it's planned or unplanned. I think that, that's probably not even the worst, right? I think there are 5 really devastating potential threats that could change the entire global security paradigm and could bring us to the brink or even through the threshold of World War III. That would be like a massive cyber attack, which we're getting closer and closer. The last one, the Salt Typhoon attack, Chinese attack, got into US communications infrastructure. I think we are potentially on the brink of some sort of like terrorist attack that would be not just against the US, but would be against any countries that also supported Israel in its attacks against Gaza. Because all that work we did, fragmenting all of those, terrorist organizations, we just threw it out, when we, with our staunch, unbridled support to Israel. And not saying, I'm not opining on whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do, but I am saying that it did, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So it did really galvanize these Muslim and extremist organizations against those that supported Israel without any consideration for the Palestinians. And I think climate change. So if you wanted to know, to me, like if you wanted to ask me what I thought was the most underestimated or underappreciated threat, it would absolutely be the geopolitical conflicts that will arise from climate change. We're not talking about, the scarce resources like water and agricultural collapse. Water is an issue already everywhere. I mean, like in the United States, even water within the United States, and then the water issue between the United States and Mexico is creating problems and friction. Countries like Iran, they have basically depleted their entire aquifer for their major cities, right? There's no more water. We can't make water, right? Unless we start really investing in desalination, which very few countries have done. So water is going to be an issue, and the changing climate is going to force migrations that are going to, remember that polarization that we talked about? There, it doesn't matter whether it's Barack Obama or Pope John Paul. It does not matter who's in charge. When people can no longer make a living because of droughts or because of extreme heat and other extreme weather, they're going to have to move to out of inhospitable climates into better climates. And that's what's happening in Africa. Northern Africans and even Southern Africans are moving north so that they can, establish livelihoods and live in places where they have water and can grow food. Same thing is happening in Latin America. Those populations that depend on, water for tourism and agriculture and other jobs, they're no longer available. So it's either move up or starve. And that is putting pressure on governments to provide infrastructure for these people. And it's creating such, resentment and anger in those, in those countries that they want to move to in Europe and in the United States, that, there are no easy solutions. And the only thing that is, to me, obvious is that it will create conflict and friction. Whether that conflict is war or economic conflict or whatever, I don't know, because I don't have a crystal ball. But if I had enough time to scenario plan all of these things, I don't think we'd like what our options are, like what it looks like on the other side.
My blood pressure just went through the roof. So with climate change, the Arctic is shrinking, well, the ice is melting, which is opening up new trade routes.
Yes.
Which is why Trump is so fixated on acquiring Greenland. So that's also where a point of conflict could really pop off.
Absolutely.
Over the Arctic.
And think about this, right? So that new trade route, right? That new northern trade route will cut almost 3 weeks off of the transportation time that it takes to get products from Asia to the West, right? That's huge. That is literally hundreds of billions of dollars in savings. And, that's fuel costs and demurrage and insurance. And it's incredible how much time, how valuable that time is. And then more importantly, whoever controls those, navigable maritime commerce routes can also set up military outposts, right? Because that's what we do, right? For security and stability. And the US has pulled back from its, global policeman role, right? Which has made everything much less governable and much less secure. So so you have that, which is also why Trump is joking about, Canada being the 51st state. So it's not really a joke. I would not be surprised to see some sort of movement in that direction. And if you really do want to understand where the U.S. politics are going, definitely read Project 2025. It's 1,000 pages, but you should 100% read it because that's the blueprint. But the other thing about the Arctic that I think goes a little bit unnoticed is two things. One, that the Arctic is a huge source of protein, right? Especially for China, which is why China keeps trying to hone its way in there, horn its way in as a near Arctic power, right? Because they need protein, right? They have overfished all of their own coastlines and all the other coastlines that they've acquired, right? So they need protein, and they need the incredible incredible amounts of protein that are in the Arctic right now. And on top of that, there are mineral resources, right? And we're already starting to see investments into deep seabed mining, but it's not just for, critical minerals. It's for other things that we don't even know exist. And that's the other reason why they want to master quantum, because quantum will be able to tell us, if you do this, and this simultaneously, this can happen, right? So it's so incredible how all these things fit together and either create opportunities or risks and threats geopolitically.
You're brimming with so much knowledge of what's actually going on in the world geopolitically, how things might pan out in the next 5 to 10 years, different scenarios, and how companies could potentially navigate this. This is a big question because you've said so much. But if you could offer one piece of strategic advice to global business leaders looking to thrive in this era of change, what would it be?
That's actually pretty easy. I would definitely recommend that they build geopolitical fluency into the fabric or DNA of the company, right? Geopolitical fluency should not be an add-on or bolt-on capability. It should be part of the company, and it should permeate all different lines of business, right? So it shouldn't just be, in the enterprise risk management silo. It should inform all the decisions they make about logistics and supply chains, investments, markets that they should enter, markets they shouldn't enter, right? Because supply chains and risk is no longer just regional or geographic. It is 100% political. And so if you understand geopolitics and you thread that through all your decision making and your strategies and your strategic planning, you will be able to, as I said before, anticipate what's coming next and avoid surprises. You can plan for things, you can mitigate risk, you can transfer risk. In some cases, you can avoid risk altogether. But that's what I would recommend is, build your own geopolitical capability and use it for scenario planning, for strategizing, for, for chain risk mapping, right? So not just mapping the risks that we know today, but what about the second and third order effects, right? What about those places where those lines intersect?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few questions from Tatiana. If there is a third world war, will it be fought with boots on the ground or will it be fought mainly with technology?
It'll be a combination of both. It won't be just technology, because you have to have a human in the loop. At least it really I should say it depends on how long from now, how far left of boom we're talking. So I think if World War III happens in the next 10 years, definitely boots on the ground. After that, I don't really know. After quantum comes online, I can't really tell.
Yeah. Decrypt, encrypt. That's the only thing that sticks in my head. There's no security for anything when quantum comes out.
No, we're going to have to figure that out. Some smart people are going to have to figure that out.
Well, that makes me think that I want to go back to a black and white Nokia, and then maybe just having a few
analog.
Maybe it'll tip the scale the other way, where people know that they actually have no security really, because anyone can hack them. So you actually go more offline. I don't know, but that's my humble opinion. I would definitely take yours. Another question: if the world is in this much trouble and all of these threats are inevitable, is Project 2025 wrong?
That's a great question. And I don't really have a good answer for that. There are some pieces of 2025 that I agree with. And I do even, the fact that the US deficit is so unsustainable, it's creating so many problems, right? I mean, we've already been downgraded a couple of times, our credit has been downgraded. And if this big, beautiful bill actually passes, right, this new reconciliation, we are basically bankrupting future generations. And I think that's a problem. I really do. I think that, I love my parents, but I think boomers left us a big mess. And, my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, we didn't do very much to fix that for our kids, right? So yeah, I don't know. I can't really comment whether 2025 is right or wrong. I will say that there are definitely parts of it that I think I agree with, and then there are parts that I don't agree with.
Kate, do you have a question? We are definitely over time, but I mean, when in Rome.
It's hard to know what to ask you. There's so much there.
Yeah, so much.
The thing is, who on earth, or who, or which entity, which people, which entities is in control or has a solid overview of all this information? I mean, what you've said is so much. You need to know so much and be aware of so many things. I mean, where are these centers of knowledge and power, or has nobody got it? Is it just an amalgam?
I think it is an amalgamation. And I do think there are a lot of entities that have a handle on this, right? I don't know that they're necessarily empowered or authorized to
Mm.
do anything about it, but there are quite a few people who, who are on top of what's happening. And it is really hard, but I will tell you that, like AI does help to sort of categorize and keep on top of a lot of these topics. And I will say, I'm glad that you asked though about like, power, who can do anything about this? Because, we had this conversation before about, talk about something that's optimistic. I am very optimistic about the future. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm totally Eeyore, like in the Winnie the Pooh universe, but I can be a Tigger sometimes too. And I think that the next generation of youth is something we can count on. I really do. I think they are the hope for the future. And I really believe, and I think that what's going to happen is going to surprise us because unfortunately, if you look around the world right now, all the leaders of the major economies and the major political players are super old. They're like really, really old. And everybody is all old. So everyone's going to leave at the same time, which means we're going to have a whole entire group of new thinkers at the same time, which has never happened before. Before, it's just been gradual, right? Somebody, reaches 65, 70 years old, they retire, and somebody that's, 30 or 40 years old comes in. We have not done that. What we have done is we have just let the old people get older and older, and they are married to a world that doesn't exist and policies that don't work anymore. And so they're all pretty much going to exit, naturally at the same time. And they're going to be replaced by new thinking, new perspectives, innovative ways to solve these problems. And they're going to use technology to do it. So
Yeah.
they'll figure it out.
And they tech native. So they've grown up in a world where they really understand it.
Correct.
And that is actually a beautiful note to end this on, because this has been a relatively very insightful and interesting conversation, but also relatively heavy with a lot of threats, and there's a lot going on right now. But there is also stuff that is positive and that we can look forward to. But we definitely have got a treasure chest of knowledge from you today. Great. And thank you so much for being so gracious. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to everyone on the live stream. And goodbye.